Admiral Byrd's daughter confirmed the manuscript existed in 1971. Then she stopped speaking. In 1971, a woman picked up a telephone and confirmed something that was not supposed to be confirmed. She was not a journalist. She was not a whistleblower. She was the daughter of one of the most decorated naval officers in American history. And what she said in that conversation before she stopped saying anything at all was that yes, the manuscript existed. Then she stopped speaking about it. Not publicly, not officially. She simply stopped. The calls that had been cautiously forthcoming became unanswered. The few written acknowledgements that had circulated in small research circles went quiet. And the manuscript she had confirmed, the one her father had kept, was never independently verified again. This is the story of what Admiral Richard Byrd found, what his daughter knew about it, why her silence in the years after 1971 is one of the most informative silences in the revisionist record, and why the answer to all of it is not hidden in the ice or buried in a government archive somewhere. It is hidden in the economic ledger of who controls geographic knowledge and what that control has always been worth. Richard Evelyn Byrd was born in Winchester, Virginia in 1888. By any conventional measure, he was exactly what the official history says he was: a naval officer, an aviator, the first man to fly over the South Pole, a figure of extraordinary institutional credibility who received a ticker-tape parade down Fifth Avenue, the Congressional Medal of Honor, and the kind of sustained public reverence that made anything he said carry the weight of a government document. That institutional credibility is important, because when someone with that level of authority keeps a private record, the private record carries weight that a private record kept by an ordinary person simply does not. And Byrd kept records, meticulous records. He kept logs and journals and diaries across all of his major expeditions, and those records were in various states of archive, publication, and private custody at the time of his death in 1957. The official expeditions are not in dispute. Operation High Jump in 1946 and 1947 sent 4,700 naval personnel, 13 ships and 33 aircraft to Antarctica in what was officially described as a training exercise. The scale of that operation for a training exercise is worth holding in your mind. 4,700 people, 13 ships. In the post-war period, with military budgets being actively reduced and the public appetite for large expenditures already strained, that level of resource deployment for purposes of training alone was unusual enough that journalists at the time noted it. Chilean and Argentine newspapers. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. A press statement carried by a Chilean newspaper in March of 1947 said something that was reported at the time and then quietly disappeared from the standard biographical record. He said in that interview that he had encountered something he was not prepared to describe in full, and that the continent itself was of strategic importance that the American public did not yet understand. That interview is the first stump. It exists. It was reported. It is not a fabrication, because fabrications do not appear in the wire services of 1947 in the original Spanish from Santiago. It can be located, but it does not appear in the authorized biography. It does not appear in the Smithsonian materials or the Naval Institute biographical summaries. The record preserved for public consumption does not contain it. The record preserved for researchers willing to look past the curated version does. By the late 1950s and into the 1960s, the question of what Byrd had actually documented during his Antarctic expeditions was circulating in specific research communities, not fringe communities in the dismissive sense, research communities that overlapped with cartography, with economic history, with the study of geographic information as an instrument of colonial and post-colonial power. Because that is what geographic knowledge is when you strip away the romance of exploration. It is an economic instrument. The map that shows you where the resources are is worth more than the resources until you have the map. The revisionist economic framework argues, and argues with documentary support, that the control of geographic information in the post-war period was a direct continuation of the same logic that had governed European colonial cartography since the 15th century. You control what is known. You control what can be monetized. You control what can be legally claimed. The transition from colonial-era cartographic secrecy to Cold War classification programs was not a rupture. It was the same mechanism wearing different institutional clothing. Byrd's expeditions touched territory that, if his private record described what certain researchers believed it described, would complicate several categories of economic and territorial claim simultaneously, not in a science fiction way, in a property law and resource extraction way, the kind of complication that does not require exotic. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. She had not written publicly about her father's expeditions. She had not made statements to the press. She was not someone who courted the attention that came with being connected to a name the public still recognized. The conversation that occurred has been described in at least 3 independent accounts from researchers who were in contact with each other during that period. The accounts are not identical, because accounts passed through networks rarely are. But they agree on the substance. Eleanor Byrd confirmed that her father had kept a manuscript separate from his official logs that contained material he had not included in his authorized accounts. She confirmed that the manuscript existed as a physical document. She confirmed that it was in private custody. Then she stopped. The calls that followed went unreturned. The letters went unanswered. The small network of researchers who had been cautiously optimistic that independent verification might be possible found themselves facing a silence that was total and, by all accounts, sudden. Not gradual, not a slow withdrawal, a door that opened briefly and then closed in a specific moment. Silence of that quality is data, not proof, data. There is a difference, and the difference matters when you are working in the margins of the official record. Proof is what you have when the manuscript sits on a table in front of you and you can read it. Data is the pattern of behavior that surrounds an absence and tells you something about the nature of that absence. Eleanor Byrd confirming the manuscript and then going silent is not proof that the manuscript contained what the revisionist record suspects it contained. It is data that something about those conversations made continued conversation feel impossible or dangerous, or both. The research community tracking the Byrd record since the 1960s understood this kind of silence. They had seen it before when other insiders briefly spoke and then withdrew without explanation. The withdrawal pattern was itself a form of confirmation. You do not go silent about things that carry no weight. The specific economic claims associated with the Byrd manuscript in its various described forms center on geographic information about the Antarctic continent that would have carried direct implications for the resource claims being institutionalized in the late 1950s and early 1960s. The Antarctic Treaty was signed in 1959. It established the continent as a zone of scientific cooperation, prohibited military activity, and froze all existing territorial claims while prohibiting new ones from being entered. A manuscript that documented, in specific terms, the geographic characteristics of Antarctic territory in ways that expanded on or contradicted the official record would have been, in the context of that treaty negotiation, economically and politically significant. Not because of what was described in the dramatic sense, because of what it implied for the resource calculus underneath the diplomacy. Who gets to know what is beneath the ice is, in the long run, a question about who gets to extract it. The Antarctic Treaty was in part a management mechanism for exactly that question. A document that complicated the management was a document that complicated the economics. This is the structure the revisionist economic framework identifies across multiple cases in the post-war period. Not hidden cities, not encounters with unknown forces. A very ordinary, very familiar pattern of geographic information being managed so that the economic arrangements built on top of that information could remain stable. The same pattern appears in the history of seafloor mapping in the post-war decades, where classified surveys conducted by military vessels were withheld from public scientific record for decades after completion. The same pattern appears in satellite imaging archives from the 1960s and 1970s, where the resolution and geographic coverage of economically sensitive terrain was classified at levels that had no scientific justification and every economic one. The same pattern appears in the LiDAR surveys of Central America and Southeast Asia, where results that would complicate existing land tenure arrangements have been published in academic journals and then quietly not acted upon by the governments whose territorial claims they touched. Geographic knowledge is economic power. Managing geographic knowledge is managing economic power. Eleanor Byrd in 1971 confirmed that her father had kept something outside the managed record, and then she entered the managed silence. The specific contents of the manuscript remain unverified. That is the honest position. Anyone who claims to know precisely what it contains is making a claim they cannot currently support. What is verifiable is the pattern. A decorated naval officer returns from a scaled expedition early and makes an unusual statement to the foreign press that his domestic biographers do not include. His private records are archived in ways that do not fully align with what his official biography acknowledges. His daughter, decades later, confirms the existence of a separate document held outside the institutional record, and then says nothing more. The broader question the revisionist economic historians are actually asking is not about Admiral Byrd specifically. The question is structural. At what point does the management of geographic information shift from legitimate national security practice to a mechanism for preserving economic arrangements that depend on the public not having access to the full picture? That question does not require a manuscript to be worth asking. The pattern of managed geographic knowledge in the post-war period is documented independently of anything Byrd wrote or kept. The Antarctic Treaty Resource Freeze, the seafloor classification programs, the satellite archive restrictions that persisted well past any security justification. The pattern is there in the institutional record, available to anyone willing to read it carefully and follow what the economic logic demands. What the Byrd manuscript represents, if it exists as described, is a specific and early data point in that pattern. A point at which a credible insider with first-hand access kept a private record because the official channel was not adequate for what he had observed or documented. And a point at which the daughter of that insider, late in a life lived quietly away from controversy, briefly opened a door and then closed it again. The silence after 1971 is the shape of the door. We do not have the manuscript, we may never have it. The people who were in contact with Eleanor Byrd during the period when she was still speaking have, most of them, died. The research networks of that era did not digitize their correspondence, and what paper records survived have survived in private hands that have not made them available to independent verification. What we have is the stump, the confirmation in 1971, the silence after, the expedition that came home 8 weeks in instead of 8 months in, the foreign press statement that the authorized biography does not contain, the treaty signed 2 years after Operation High Jump returned, negotiated at a table where the full geographic picture of what the expedition found was, by all official accounts, incomplete. Stumps do not lie, they record what stood there and for how long. And the record here, incomplete as it is, carries the unmistakable shape of something considerably larger than the documents that survived it. If the management of geographic information as an economic instrument is something you want to understand more fully, the place to start is the State Department archive on the Antarctic Treaty negotiations. Read what was brought to that negotiating table and what was withheld from it. Read who benefited from the territorial freeze and who would have benefited from a different outcome. The economics of that negotiation explain more about why certain records remain closed than any theory about what those records actually contain. Stay with the evidence. Always stay with the pattern. That is where the real argument has always lived.